Oh hey everyone, welcome back to Not a Historian, where for the past few weeks we have been discussing the Soviet Union. Last we left off, the USSR had just come out victorious in World War II, along with its powerful ally, the United States. Today we're going to discuss how that friendly relationship turns out. Okay, so right after World War II, we have something called the Cold War, which was not a war as in wars with shooting, unless you count the proxy wars that the two major powers pitted against each other. This was a war of politics, of technology, and of propaganda and fear. And the two major powers were the Soviet Union and the United States. So let's dive into this topic. Now, right before World War II had ended, the three major Allied leaders, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and later his successor, US President Harry S. Truman, and our good buddy Stalin, met in a conference at the little German town of Potsdam near Berlin. First, they issued a declaration warning Japan that they surrender or else face total destruction. And then they got to the real deal, hammering out what was to happen after the war in Europe. So at the Potsdam Conference, the Allied leaders carved up Germany between the four of them, counting France. So we have four different occupation zones in Germany: the British, the French, the American, and the Soviets. And over here, you'll see a bunch of colors here too. Oh, would you look at that? It's Berlin. It's divided up into occupation zones as well: French, British, American, and Soviet. And Germany and Berlin will come up again and again and again in this video and the next. And many people don't know this, but Austria was also divided into occupation zones: French, American, British, Soviet. And over here, Vienna was also divided into occupation zones, just like Berlin. Although it was a little more messy. We have a chunk of Soviet here, a chunk of Soviet here, some British over here, French, and American. So the reunification of Austria went off without a hitch. But Germany was a little more complicated, as we'll get into later. The Potsdam Conference gave Stalin and the Soviet Union a great control over Eastern Europe. They wanted Stalin to make a free, capitalist Eastern Europe. Guess what Stalin did? He made them all communist. He installed puppet governments here, and to a lesser extent here and here. And this made the other three allies very nervous. And then things started getting rocky between the former chums. During World War II, the British and the Soviets had invaded Iran in order to gain more access to its oil fields. After the war, the British pulled out of Iran, but the Soviets were like, I might as well just stay around. I like the oil. The newly formed United Nations stepped in and kicked them out eventually. There was also something called the Turkish Straits crisis, in which the Soviets came down to Turkey and said, hey, you see these straits over here that separate Europe and Asia? Yeah, I want them. I want greater control of them, so let me in. And the Turks were like, I'm not supposed to let in strangers into my house. Go away. And then the United States came along with his warships, and he was like, yes, Soviets, get out of here. And then we have, Berlin. As I said before, Berlin is a very complicated situation. The former allies had very different views on how Berlin should be. The Anglo-Americans wanted a strong Germany and a strong Berlin in order to avoid economic collapse and another world war, because they believed the Great Depression had caused the Germans to become desperate enough to support Hitler and his Nazis. The Soviets, who had just suffered 2 German invasions in the span of 30 years, were like, we want a weak Germany so it can never threaten us again. And eventually the Western Allies occupation zones in Germany became West Germany, and the Soviet occupation zone became East Germany, and the occupation zones in Berlin went to West and East Germany accordingly. So in the nice city of Berlin, Truman and Stalin had an argument over German currency. And Stalin, who wanted to show the Allies the strength of the Soviets, was like, you know what? We're blocking all the supply routes to and from Berlin. Your citizens will starve, and you will know that the Soviet might is not to be messed with, and that you have to accept our currency plan for Germany. Then Truman was like, bring in the planes. The cargo planes that Truman sent in dropped tons of supplies on parachutes into Berlin in what became known as the Berlin Airlift that lasted for about a year. Berlin was safe, and Stalin became known as the guy who was willing to starve innocent citizens in his quest for global hegemony. In 1947, Stalin created Cominform to replace the earlier Comintern created by Lenin, and both organizations gave him more power over what became known as the Eastern Bloc, Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Excluding Yugoslavia and Albania over here, though, those were more free to do their own thing. He also established Comecon, which was supposed to counter the U.S. Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan gave economic aid to war-torn countries in Western Europe, so Stalin felt he could do the same with Eastern Europe and other communist countries. And also the Western Allies established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which still exists today, in order to counter the Soviet Union and quote-unquote contain communism. And then we come to China, the United States' old buddy, in fighting Japan. Now, since 1927, China had been going through a civil war, the brutality and bloodiness of which was on par with the American Civil War. It pitted the Chinese Communist Party with the capitalist Kuomintang, or the nationalists, and the two sides duked it out for decades. There was a brief pause when Japan showed up uninvited and invaded, but when they surrendered, the fight went on again, and both sides proceeded to tear each other apart in the name of Chang or Mao or whatever. The Soviets supported the Chinese Communist Party as they saw them being their allies in the fight against so-called imperialism. And eventually, the nationalists were kicked out of mainland China and they fled to Taiwan. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, which signaled the world that the United States was not the only nuclear power out there, oh no. And there was the very real possibility of nuclear war now, because if war broke out between the Soviet Union and the United States, they would most certainly use the nuclear weapons. Alright, now we come to Korea. After World War II, the Korean Peninsula had been divided along the 30th parallel. In the north, the Soviets installed a communist government, the Democratic Republic of Korea. And in the south, the United States installed an anti-communist government, the Republic of Korea. With the backing of the Soviet Union, North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. And the South Koreans, who were woefully unprepared, were pushed south to this line here, this perimeter here called the Pusan perimeter. That was the South Korean front line. Until the United Nations came in and said, hey, cut it out, and sent their own troops into Korea and pushed the North Koreans back, all the way up, almost to the border with China. And this is where the newly communist China gets a little worried. They were afraid that the United Nations would just keep going and invade China. And they were like, no, this is not going to happen. And so they intervened in the conflict, invading Korea and pushing the UN troops, who are led mostly by the United States, south of the 30th parallel. And then the United Nations proceeded to push them back north again, back to roughly where the border had been when the war started. And it has been a stalemate ever since. By 1953, Stalin had died, and after a brief power struggle was replaced by Putin, who increased the size and power of the Russian military, annexed the Crimea, engaged in some questionable affairs with Donald Trump. Wait, what's that? It wasn't Putin? Are you sure? Okay. Okay, so Nikita Khrushchev took over after the brief power struggle, and he publicly declared that Stalin sucked. And he went about de-Stalinizing Soviet society, which means implementing some small reforms but nothing big enough to disrupt the entire balance of socialism. In 1957, the Soviets launched the space race by sending the first man-made satellite into orbit called Sputnik 1. And this shocked the world, all the more so in the United States, because they were afraid that if the Soviets knew how to get to space, they could nuke America from there, I don't know. And a month later, the Soviets launched the first living thing into space, a dog named Laika aboard Sputnik 2. In 1954, France and the Algerians were locked in a war of independence for Algeria. On the French side was the 4th and then 5th French Republic. And then in Algeria, there's the FLN, who was fighting for Algeria's independence. Khrushchev and the Soviets supported the FLN and gave them large amounts of military aid. And after they had won their independence, the Algerians continued to have chummy relationships with the Soviet Union for decades. In 1960, an American U-2 spy plane crashed on Soviet soil. The Soviets were a bit annoyed at the Americans. The Americans just played innocent. We didn't want that to happen. Okay, it was an accident. However, a year later, an RB-47 intelligence plane crashed on Soviet soil. This time the Soviets were fuming. Steam was pouring out of its ears. The United States still played innocent. It was another accident, although they were probably sweating from head to toe by now. In 1961, the Soviet Union achieved another first in the space race by launching the first man into space and into orbit aboard Vostok 1. He was an Air Force pilot called Yuri Gagarin. And after a successful mission and return, he became a global celebrity, with his handsome face and his friendly demeanor, He was actually quite charming. And again, the Americans were shocked at the news of this because they had already launched their own manned space flight program. And here they were, the Soviets were beating them to the punch, and the United States was falling way behind. Then we come to the issue of Berlin again. Now, living conditions in East Berlin were much worse than living conditions in West Berlin. East Berlin being the area of Berlin controlled by the Soviets, West Berlin being the area of Berlin controlled by the capitalists. And because of this, many East Berliners fled across the open border to West Berlin for better living conditions. And so, Khrushchev was like, we're gonna build a wall in order to separate West Berlin from East Berlin to prevent any more East Berliners from fleeing to West Berlin because of its supposedly better living conditions. So that was done. Between 1961 and 1989, the Soviets built a wall around West Berlin in order to keep the West Berliners in and the East Berliners out. And the Americans were like, this is ridiculous, you're gonna build a wall? What? And so as a show of strength, the United States rolled the tanks up to the wall. The Soviets did the same, and the two sides were on the edge of war, and the world was standing on a knife's blade, where one side would be safety and the other side would be total nuclear destruction. Until the United States and the Soviet Union were like, hey, we need to work this out. We can't destroy the world, okay? Let's talk. And they pulled their tanks away from the wall. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you won't miss any of my new videos. And also leave a comment. What did I leave out? What should I talk about in the future? I am not a historian, so please feel free to criticize me for anything that I said wrong, and I'll see you next time.